The courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning. Reporters lined the back walls, their cameras ready. Curious onlookers filled every available seat. Everyone wanted to see what would happen to the man who'd once graced the cover of Forbes magazine. The tech genius who'd built a billion-dollar empire from his college dorm room. Daniel Whitmore sat at the defense table, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, but his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through papers he wasn't really reading. At 52 years old, he'd faced down corporate raiders, survived market crashes, and built technology that changed how millions of people lived their daily lives. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. The charges against him were serious. The prosecution claimed he'd stolen over $30 million from investors, hiding the money in offshore accounts while his company struggled. They said he'd falsified financial reports, lied to shareholders, and enriched himself while thousands of employees worried about their jobs. If convicted, he faced up to 20 years in federal prison. For 6 months, Daniel had insisted on his innocence to anyone who would listen. He'd hired the best lawyer money could buy, a man named Gerald Hutchins who'd never lost a major case in 15 years. Gerald had been confident, even cocky, telling Daniel that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and that they'd tear it apart piece by piece. But something changed that morning. Gerald arrived late, his usual swagger gone. He kept checking his phone, his face growing paler with each glance at the screen. When the judge entered and everyone rose, Gerald remained distracted, barely acknowledging the court's formalities. Then came the moment that changed everything. Just as the judge was about to call the court to order for the day's proceedings, Gerald stood abruptly. His voice was strained when he spoke. "Your Honor, I need to request a sidebar immediately." The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Chen who'd been on the bench for 23 years, looked annoyed but nodded. Gerald and the lead prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man named James Thornton, approached the bench. Their whispered conversation lasted only a few minutes, but Daniel could see the judge's expression shift from annoyance to shock. When they returned, Gerald wouldn't meet Daniel's eyes. The judge cleared her throat and the courtroom fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unusual situation. Mr. Hutchins has informed the court that he must withdraw from this case immediately due to what he claims is a conflict of interest. This is highly irregular given that we are already well into trial proceedings." The courtroom erupted. Reporters started typing frantically. The prosecution looked just as surprised as everyone else. Daniel felt his stomach drop. He grabbed Gerald's arm. "What are you doing?" "What conflict? We've been working together for months." Gerald finally looked at him, and Daniel saw something in his lawyer's eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. Pure, genuine fear. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I can't explain right now, but I can't represent you anymore. I just can't." And with that, Gerald Hutchins, the man who'd cost Daniel $500,000 in legal fees, gathered his briefcase and walked out of the courtroom. Just walked out, leaving Daniel sitting alone at the defense table while everyone stared. The judge called for order, her gavel cracking against the bench repeatedly. When the room finally quieted, she looked at Daniel with something that might have been sympathy. "Mr. Whitmore, you have a constitutional right to representation. However, given the circumstances, we have limited options. I can assign you a public defender, though they would need time to familiarize themselves with your case, which could take weeks. Or we can postpone the trial entirely while you secure new counsel, though I warn you that could take months and you'd remain under the same bail restrictions." Daniel's mind raced. Weeks or months more of this nightmare. His company's stock had already plummeted. Business partners had abandoned him. His ex-wife had fought to limit his time with their teenage daughter, citing the charges. Every day this dragged on, his life fell apart a little more. But it wasn't just his life he was thinking about. Sitting in the gallery, 5 rows back, was someone who'd been there every single day of the trial, someone who'd known him for 15 years, who'd seen him at his best and his worst, who'd been more of a constant in his life than almost anyone else. Rose Williams was 58 years old. With gray-streaked hair she kept pulled back in a neat bun. She wore the same thing she wore every day to court, a simple dress and comfortable shoes. She'd taken vacation time from her job as Daniel's housekeeper to attend the trial, insisting she wanted to support him even though he'd told her it wasn't necessary. Rose had started working for Daniel when his company was still small, when he'd just bought his first real house. She'd watched him build his empire. She'd cleaned the office where he'd worked late into the night, and she'd seen the stacks of thank you letters from people whose lives his technology had changed. She'd been there when his mother died, and she'd held him while he cried like a child. She'd organized the charity events he'd funded anonymously, the scholarships he'd created, the medical bills he'd paid for employees who couldn't afford treatment. Rose knew Daniel Whitmore better than the reporters who called him a thief, better than the prosecutors who painted him as a greedy villain, better than even some of his own family, members who distanced themselves when the accusation started, and she knew he was innocent as the judge continued talking about legal procedures and constitutional rights. Rose felt something building inside her. It was the same feeling she'd had years ago when her son was sick, and the insurance company denied his cancer treatment. The same feeling she'd had when her daughter applied to colleges but couldn't afford any of them. It was a feeling that said enough is enough, that sometimes you have to stand up even when it seems crazy, even when everyone will think you've lost your mind. She thought about something her grandmother used to tell her. Baby, when you see wrong being done and you got the power to do something about it, staying quiet makes you part of the wrong. Rose stood up. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. People near her glanced over, probably thinking she needed to use the restroom. But Rose kept standing, and then she spoke. Your Honor. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the quiet courtroom everyone heard it. Heads turned. The judge looked up, confused. Ma'am, please sit down. We're in the middle of, Your Honor, I'll defend him. Now the entire courtroom was staring at her. Someone laughed nervously. The prosecutor, Thornton, looked amused. Even Daniel turned around, his face pale with shock. Rose, no, he said. You can't. But Rose was already walking down the aisle between the seats. Her legs felt shaky, but she kept moving forward. She'd never been more terrified in her life, but she'd also never been more certain of anything. The judge held up a hand, her expression somewhere between bewilderment and frustration. Ma'am, I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing, but this is a federal criminal trial, not a television drama. You can't just volunteer to defend someone. Rose reached the barrier that separated the gallery from the court area. She looked directly at Judge Chen, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. My name is Rose Williams. I've worked for Mr. Whitmore for 15 years. I know I'm not a lawyer, but I know he's innocent and I know the truth, and I'm asking you to let me help him prove it. The courtroom exploded into noise again. Reporters were practically climbing over each other. The prosecutor was objecting loudly. But Rose didn't look away from the judge, and Judge Chen, for her part, didn't immediately dismiss the idea. Instead, she studied Rose's face for a long moment. Finally, the judge's gavel cracked down again. We're taking a 30-minute recess. Everyone out except counsel, and that includes you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Whitmore, you stay as well. We need to discuss this situation immediately. As the courtroom cleared, Rose felt Daniel looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude? Horror? Disbelief? Probably all three. She gave him a small nod, trying to look more confident than she felt. Because the truth was, Rose had no idea what happened next. She only knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let an innocent man go to prison without a fight. The judge's chambers felt smaller than Rose had imagined. Law books lined every wall, certificates hung in neat rows, and the air smelled like coffee and old paper. Judge Chen sat behind her desk, looking at Rose with an expression that was hard to read. Daniel sat in one of the leather chairs, still looking shell-shocked. The prosecutor, Thornton, stood near the window, arms crossed, clearly irritated by this entire situation. Ms. Williams, the judge began, removing her glasses and rubbing her eyes. I've been on the bench for over 2 decades. I've seen a lot of unusual things. But this is unprecedented. Do you understand what you're proposing? Rose sat straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. I know it sounds crazy, Your Honor. I know I'm not qualified in the way a lawyer is, but I've spent the last 6 months watching this trial. I've spent my evenings reading law books from Mr. Whitmore's library, and I've found things that his lawyer missed. Important things, Thornton scoffed. Your Honor, this is absurd. We can't let a housekeeper play lawyer in a federal criminal trial. The woman probably doesn't even understand basic legal procedures, let alone complex financial fraud statutes. Rose turned to look at him. I understand that the prosecution has the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I understand that hearsay is generally inadmissible unless it falls under specific exceptions. I understand that evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment can be excluded under the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. I've been studying, Mr. Thornton. Maybe you should stop underestimating people who clean your offices. The room went quiet. Judge Chen raised her eyebrows, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Thornton's face reddened. Daniel finally found his voice. Rose, I appreciate what you're trying to do, more than you know, but I can't let you do this. You have a family to think about. Your reputation, your job. If this goes wrong, an innocent man goes to prison, Rose interrupted gently. Mr. Whitmore, do you remember 7 years ago when my son got sick? When the cancer treatment cost more than I'd make in 10 years and the insurance wouldn't cover it? Daniel looked down. Rose, you don't need to. You paid for everything. Every single treatment. You told me it was a company benefit, but I found out later you paid it yourself. My boy is alive today because of you. Her voice cracked slightly. And my daughter? She's in her 3rd year of college right now because you gave her a scholarship. You didn't even tell us. We found out when the school said her tuition was covered by an anonymous donor. But your assistant accidentally sent me the paperwork. That's not relevant to this case, Thornton said impatiently. Rose turned back to the judge. It's relevant because it shows character. It shows who this man really is. And I know things about this case that no one else knows because I've been in that house. I've seen the papers. I've heard the phone calls. I've found evidence that Mr. Hutchins never even looked at. Judge Chen leaned forward. What kind of evidence? Financial records that were misfiled. Documents that show someone else had access to Mr. Whitmore's accounts. Phone logs that prove he was in a different state when some of these supposed crimes happened. Rose pulled a folder from her bag. She'd brought it to court every day just in case. I found these in a storage room that was being cleared out. They were going to be thrown away. The judge took the folder and began looking through it. Her expression grew more serious with each page. Thornton moved closer, trying to see what she was reading. After several minutes, Judge Chen looked up. Ms. Williams, where exactly did you find these? In the basement storage area of Mr. Whitmore's company headquarters. I was helping organize old files for donation when I noticed the dates on some boxes didn't match what was written on the labels. I started looking through them more carefully. And you understand chain of custody issues? That these documents might not be admissible if they weren't properly preserved? I do, Your Honor. But they point to where you need to look. They show that there's more to this case than what's been presented. Rose took a breath. I also know something else. I know that Richard Dane, the chief financial officer who's testifying against Mr. Whitmore, is lying. Now she had everyone's full attention. Thornton straightened up. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Williams. I know it is, and I can prove it. Rose looked at the judge. Mr. Dane claims he bought a yacht with inheritance money from his grandmother, but I've been to his mother's house. She's alive and lives in an assisted living facility that Mr. Whitmore helps pay for, because Mr. Dane said he couldn't afford it. I've seen the Christmas cards from his family. His grandmother died when he was 12 years old. There was no inheritance, so where did the money for that yacht come from? The room fell silent. Judge Chen set the folder down and steepled her fingers, thinking. Thornton's confident expression had shifted to something more concerned. Your Honor, Thornton said carefully, even if Ms. Williams has found some interesting information, that doesn't qualify her to defend Mr. Whitmore in a criminal trial. This is highly irregular and potentially grounds for appeal if we proceed. He's right, Daniel said quietly. Rose, I know you're trying to help, but this could backfire. They could use this to claim I didn't have adequate counsel. It could make things worse. Rose turned to Daniel. Mr. Whitmore, do you trust me? He looked at her, really looked at her, and Rose saw tears in his eyes. With my life, then let me do this. Let me fight for you the way you fought for my family when we needed help. Judge Chen stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city below. Everyone waited. The silence stretched out until Rose thought she might scream from the tension. Finally, the judge turned back. Here's what I'm prepared to do. Mr. Whitmore has the constitutional right to defend himself if he chooses. He also has the right to have someone assist him in his defense, even if that person isn't a licensed attorney. It's rare, but it's legal. Your Honor, Thornton started. I'm not finished, Mr. Thornton. The judge's voice was firm. However, I'm not going to allow this to turn into a circus. Ms. Williams, if you're going to do this, you need to demonstrate that you understand basic legal procedure. I'm going to give you 48 hours. In that time, You'll meet with the court's legal advisor. They'll assess whether you have sufficient understanding to proceed. If you pass that assessment and if Mr. Whitmore formally chooses to accept your assistance in his defense, then I'll allow it. Rose felt her heart leap. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet. You'll need to file proper motions, follow court procedures, and if you make too many mistakes, I'll halt the proceedings and assign proper counsel. The judge looked stern. This is a person's freedom at stake. I'm giving you a chance because I believe everyone deserves a real defense and because something about Mr. Hutchins's sudden departure troubles me. But you'll need to prove you can handle this. The next 48 hours were the most intense of Rose's life. She barely slept. Daniel arranged for his former law school roommate, a semi-retired attorney named Thomas Chen, to help prepare her. Thomas had been practicing law for 30 years and had nothing but time since his retirement. They met in Daniel's home office, surrounded by law books and case files. Thomas was patient but demanding, drilling Rose on courtroom procedures, evidence rules, and proper objection protocols. You need to understand, Thomas told her on the first night, the prosecutor is going to try to intimidate you. He's going to use legal jargon to confuse you. He's going to object to everything you do, hoping you'll make mistakes. You need to stay calm, stay focused, and remember that you're there to tell a story. The jury doesn't care about fancy legal language. They care about the truth. Rose absorbed everything like a sponge. She learned how to frame questions, how to introduce evidence, how to make objections that would actually hold up in court. But more than that, she and Thomas went through all the evidence again, this time with fresh eyes. That's when they found it. Hidden in the financial records Rose had discovered, buried in dozens of pages of transactions, was a pattern. Money had been flowing out of Daniel's company into what looked like his personal accounts. But if you looked closer, if you traced the account numbers carefully, you realized they weren't quite right. The numbers were off by just 1 or 2 digits. Someone created fake accounts, Thomas said, his eyes widening. Accounts that would look like Daniel's at first glance, but that actually belonged to someone else. And if you were investigating quickly or if you wanted to find evidence against Daniel, you might not notice the difference. Rose felt her pulse quicken. So where did the money actually go? They spent hours tracing the real account numbers. Finally, at 2 a.m. on the second night, they found the answer. The accounts belonged to a shell company, registered in Delaware under a name that was very similar to one of Daniel's legitimate businesses. The registration papers listed a corporate address that turned out to be a mail drop. But the person who'd signed for the company registration had to show ID, and that person was Richard Dane. Rose sat back in her chair, exhausted but energized. He framed him. Dane stole the money, created these fake accounts to make it look like Daniel did it, and then offered to testify against him to save himself. Thomas nodded slowly. That's what it looks like. But proving it in court is going to be another matter entirely. Dane has immunity for his testimony. He's the prosecution's star witness, and he's going to lie on that stand as convincingly as possible. Then I'll have to be more convincing when I question him, Rose said. On the morning of the 48th hour, Rose met with the court's legal advisor. The woman was skeptical at first, firing questions at Rose about procedure and protocol. But Rose answered each one, drawing on everything she'd learned over the past months of watching the trial and the past 2 days of intensive preparation. Finally, the advisor sat back and looked at Rose with something like respect. You've done your homework, Ms. Williams. I still think this is unorthodox and potentially risky, but you know more than some law school graduates I've seen. I'll recommend to Judge Chen that you be allowed to proceed. That afternoon, the court reconvened. The gallery was even more packed than before, word having spread about the housekeeper, who was going to defend a billionaire. Cameras from every news station crowded the courthouse steps. Judge Chen looked at Rose. Ms. Williams, my legal advisor has assessed your competency. She believes you have sufficient understanding of legal procedure to assist in Mr. Whitmore's defense. However, I want to be clear, you will follow every rule of this court. You will maintain proper decorum. And if at any point I believe you're unable to provide adequate assistance, I will step in. Do you understand? Rose stood. I understand, Your Honor. Mr. Whitmore, do you formally accept Ms. Williams as your legal representative? Daniel stood beside Rose. For a moment, he looked at her and she saw everything in his eyes. Fear, gratitude, hope, and trust. Then he turned to the judge. I do, Your Honor, completely and without reservation. Judge Chen nodded. Very well. Let the record show that the defendant has chosen to proceed with Ms. Rose Williams assisting in his defense. We'll resume testimony tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned. As people filed out, Thornton approached the defense table. He looked at Rose with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. I hope you know what you're doing, Ms. Williams. This isn't going to end the way you think it will. Rose met his eyes steadily. We'll see, Mr. Thornton. We'll see. That night, Rose went home to her small apartment and stood in front of her mirror. She thought about her grandmother's words again, about standing up against wrong. She thought about her children, who'd called to tell her she was crazy, but that they loved her. She thought about Daniel, sitting in his big house, probably unable to sleep, his entire future resting on a housekeeper's determination. And Rose thought about tomorrow, when she'd stand in that courtroom and fight for the truth. She was terrified, but she was ready. The courtroom felt different when Rose walked in the next morning. Every seat was filled and people lined the walls, standing room only. She recognized faces from the local news stations, national reporters she'd seen on television, and legal analysts who'd probably come to watch what they expected would be a disaster. Rose wore a simple navy dress that her daughter had helped her pick out, professional but not pretentious. She carried a briefcase that Thomas had lent her, filled with notes and documents she'd organized obsessively the night before. Her hands wanted to shake, but she wouldn't let them. Not here. Not now. Daniel was already seated at the defense table. He gave her a small nod of encouragement, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched tight. His entire life depended on what happened over the next few days, and they both knew it. Judge Chen entered, and everyone rose. When they sat back down, Rose could feel hundreds of eyes on her back. She heard whispers, probably people making bets on how quickly this would fall apart. She didn't let herself think about that. Instead, she focused on what Thomas had told her. Tell the story, stay calm, and remember that the truth was on their side. Mr. Thornton, the judge said, you may continue with your case. The prosecutor stood, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He looked even more confident than before, probably thrilled that his opponent was now a housekeeper instead of a seasoned attorney. He called his next witness, an FBI forensic accountant named Patricia Hughes. Patricia was impressive. She had credentials that took 3 minutes just to read into the record. She'd been tracking financial crimes for 15 years and had testified in dozens of cases. She brought up charts on a large screen, showing the flow of money from Daniel's company into what she identified as his personal accounts. Ms. Hughes, Thornton said, walking her through the testimony, in your expert opinion, do these transactions show a pattern consistent with embezzlement? Yes, they do. The money was systematically diverted over an 18-month period, always in amounts small enough to avoid immediate detection, but totaling over $30 million. Rose watched carefully, taking notes. She'd studied these same financial records, but seeing them presented this way with Patricia's authoritative voice explaining them made them look damning. The jury was paying close attention, and Rose could see doubt settling on their faces. Thornton spent over an hour having Patricia explain every detail of the money trail. He was building what looked like an airtight case. When he finally said, no further questions, he sat down with a satisfied expression. Judge Chen looked at Rose. Ms. Williams, do you wish to cross-examine this witness? This was it, Rose's first real test. She stood, her heart pounding, but her voice came out steady. Yes, Your Honor. She approached the witness stand, meeting Patricia's eyes. The accountant looked at her with professional courtesy, but also clear skepticism. Rose decided to start with something simple. Ms. Hughes, you mentioned that you traced these transactions to Mr. Whitmore's personal accounts, correct? That's correct. And you verified these account numbers yourself? Yes, I did. They're listed in our evidence as belonging to Mr. Whitmore. Rose pulled out a document from her briefcase. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit A. These are Mr. Whitmore's actual bank statements for the time period in question. Thornton stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. We weren't provided with this exhibit during discovery. Rose was ready for this. Thomas had warned her it would come. Your Honor, these are Mr. Whitmore's own bank records. The defense is entitled to present them. The prosecution has had access to this same information through their investigation. I'm simply providing certified copies directly from the bank. Judge Chen examined the documents. The objection is overruled. You may proceed, Ms. Williams. Rose handed copies to Patricia and the jury. Ms. Hughes, could you please look at the account numbers on these statements and compare them to the account numbers you traced in your investigation? Patricia studied the papers, and Rose saw the moment her expression changed. A small frown appeared on her face. They're similar, Patricia said carefully. Similar? Rose pressed gently. Or are they different? Patricia looked more closely. The numbers are off by 1 or 2 digits. So the accounts you traced the money to weren't actually Mr. Whitmore's accounts, were they? They appeared to be his accounts based on the information available during the investigation. But they weren't. Someone created accounts with numbers almost identical to Mr. Whitmore's real accounts. Isn't that possible? Thornton objected. Speculation, Your Honor. Your Honor, Rose countered. I'm asking about possibility, not certainty. Ms. Hughes is a forensic accountant with 15 years of experience. She's qualified to answer whether such a thing is technically possible. Judge Chen nodded. The witness may answer. Patricia shifted slightly in her seat. Yes, it's technically possible to create accounts with similar numbers. It would be unusual but possible. Rose nodded. And if someone wanted to frame another person for embezzlement, creating fake accounts that looked like the target's accounts at first glance would be an effective way to do it, wouldn't it? Objection. Thornton was on his feet. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Chen said. Rephrase, Ms. Williams, Rose tried again. Ms. Hughes, in your experience investigating financial crimes, have you seen cases where false accounts were created to implicate others? Yes, I have seen such cases. Thank you. No further questions. As Rose returned to her seat, she saw surprise on several jurors' faces. The absolute certainty that had been building was now cracked just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The prosecution spent the rest of the day calling more witnesses. Each one was designed to paint Daniel as greedy and dishonest. They brought in former business partners who testified about aggressive tactics. They showed emails where Daniel had pushed hard for profits, taken out of context to make him look ruthless. Rose cross-examined each witness, and with each one she learned a little more, got a little more comfortable with the rhythm of the courtroom. She was making mistakes, Thomas had warned her she would, but Judge Chen was being patient, occasionally giving her subtle guidance on procedure. By the end of the first day, Rose was exhausted. Her feet hurt from the unfamiliar dress shoes. Her head pounded from concentration, but when she got home and checked her phone, she found messages from her daughter saying people were talking about the trial online, about the housekeeper who was holding her own against a federal prosecutor. The second day started with more technical testimony about financial irregularities. Rose used the cross-examinations to plant seeds of doubt, pointing out alternative explanations, questioning assumptions, showing that things weren't always as clear as the prosecution made them seem. But then came the afternoon session. Thornton stood and announced his next witness with obvious satisfaction. The prosecution calls Richard Dane. The courtroom stirred with interest. This was the star witness, the insider who'd worked closely with Daniel for 8 years before turning against him. Rose had been dreading this moment and preparing for it obsessively. Richard Dane walked to the stand with practiced confidence. He was 43 years old, well-dressed with the kind of smooth manner that came from years of corporate presentations. He took his oath and sat down looking comfortable, like he'd been preparing for this moment for months. Thornton led him through his background, his work history with Daniel's company, his position as chief financial officer. Richard described himself as a loyal employee who'd been shocked to discover what his boss was doing. Mr. Dane, can you tell the jury what you witnessed during your time at Whitmore Technologies? Richard nodded seriously. At first, everything seemed normal. Daniel was demanding but fair. The company was doing well. But about 2 years ago, I started noticing irregularities in the accounting. Money was being moved around in ways that didn't make sense. What did you do when you noticed these irregularities? I went to Daniel directly. I asked him about the transactions. He told me not to worry about it, that he was handling some investments personally. But something felt wrong, so what did you do next? I started documenting everything. The transfers, the accounts, the timing. I kept copies of all the paperwork because I knew something wasn't right. When the amount started getting larger, I realized what was happening. He was stealing from the company. Thornton walked him through dozens of transactions, and Richard had an explanation for each one, describing how Daniel had supposedly ordered the transfers, how he'd insisted on secrecy, how he'd threatened Richard's job if he told anyone. It was devastating testimony. Richard was articulate and detailed. He showed emails, transaction records, even recordings of phone calls where Daniel allegedly discussed moving money. By the time Thornton said no further questions, the jury looked convinced. Some were glaring at Daniel with open disgust. Rose felt her stomach churning. This was worse than she'd expected. Richard's testimony was so polished, so detailed, so believable. She stood for the cross-examination, her legs feeling weak. "Mr. Dane," she began, keeping her voice steady, "you testified that you've worked for Mr. Whitmore for 8 years, correct?" "That's right." "And during that time, would you say he treated you well?" Richard shrugged. "He paid me fairly, if that's what you mean." "He did more than that, didn't he? When your mother needed to move into assisted living 3 years ago, Mr. Whitmore helped with the costs, correct?" Richard looked slightly uncomfortable. "He provided some assistance, yes." "Some assistance?" "According to these records, he's been paying 70% of your mother's care facility costs. That's over $3,000 a month." Rose pulled out the documents. "Why would he do that if you were just an employee?" "He's generous when it serves him. It bought my loyalty. Or maybe he genuinely cared about you and your family," Rose suggested. "You sent him a Christmas card last year thanking him for his kindness. Do you remember what you wrote?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Not specifically." Rose pulled out the card, preserved in a plastic sleeve. "You wrote, 'Daniel, you've been more than a boss. You've been like family. I can never repay your kindness.' Those are your words, aren't they?" "Yes, but..." "And yet 3 months later you were secretly recording him and preparing to testify against him?" "What changed, Mr. Dane?" Thornton objected. "Argumentative. Sustained," Judge Chen said. "Ms. Williams, ask questions, don't argue." Rose nodded. "Mr. Dane, you testified that you bought a yacht 6 months ago, correct?" "I saw pictures of it in the prosecution's evidence." "Yes, I bought a boat." "What does that have to do with anything?" "That boat cost $800,000. That's a lot of money. You told investigators you bought it with inheritance money from your grandmother, correct?" "That's right. But your grandmother died when you were 12 years old, didn't she?" For the first time, Richard's confidence faltered. Just for a second, but Rose saw it. "So did some of the jurors. I meant my great-aunt." "I misspoke. Your great-aunt. And she left you $800,000? "Yes. What was her name?" Richard hesitated. "Eleanor. Eleanor Dane. And when did she die?" Another hesitation. "About a year ago." Rose pulled out more documents. "I have a death certificate here for Eleanor Dane. She died 3 years ago, not 1. And according to her will, which is public record, she left her estate to a cat sanctuary in Maine. You're not mentioned anywhere in this document." The courtroom was dead silent. Richard's face had gone pale, then red. There must be some mistake in the records. Or there's a mistake in your testimony, Mr. Dane. You didn't inherit money for that yacht, did you?" "Objection." Thornton was standing. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the charges against Mr. Whitmore." "Your Honor," Rose countered, "this goes directly to Mr. Dane's credibility as a witness. If he's lying about where his money came from, the jury needs to know that." Judge Chen considered. "I'll allow it, Mr. Dane. Answer the question." Richard looked trapped. "I don't have to explain my personal finances." "Actually," Rose said quietly, "you do. You're under oath. So I'll ask you again. Where did the money for your yacht come from?" The silence stretched out. Richard glanced at Thornton, at the judge, anywhere but at Rose. Finally, he said, "I'd like to invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." The courtroom erupted. Reporters started typing frantically. Jurors looked at each other in confusion. Thornton looked like he'd been slapped. Judge Chen banged her gavel for order. When the room quieted, she looked at Richard seriously. "Mr. Dane, you've been granted immunity for your testimony in this case. Are you saying you're invoking the Fifth Amendment regarding questions about your finances?" Richard's lawyer, who'd been sitting quietly in the gallery, suddenly stood up and requested to approach the bench. There was a quick, heated sidebar conversation that Rose couldn't hear. When it ended, Judge Chen looked troubled. "We're going to take a recess. Mr. Dane, you remain under subpoena. We'll resume in 1 hour." As the courtroom cleared, Daniel grabbed Rose's arm. "What just happened?" Rose took a deep breath, her hands finally shaking now that the immediate pressure was off. I think we just cracked him. But the hard part is still coming. Thomas, who'd been sitting in the gallery, came up to them with a serious expression. Rose, that was brilliant. But be careful. If Dane's going to change his story or if his immunity is in question, things are about to get complicated fast. The prosecution is going to come back fighting harder than ever. Rose nodded, gathering her papers. She'd won this round, but the battle was far from over, and she knew that when they reconvened, Richard Dane was going to be prepared for her. The question was whether she could maintain her advantage. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters shouted questions at her. Rose ignored them, keeping her head down as she walked to her car. But she could hear their voices, feel their cameras on her. The housekeeper who was taking on the federal government. The nobody who dared to step into a courtroom. Rose thought about that as she sat in her car before driving away. Maybe she was a nobody in their eyes. But she was a nobody who was telling the truth. And sometimes that was enough. The 1-hour recess turned into 3 hours. Rose sat in a small conference room with Daniel and Thomas, knowing that something significant was happening behind closed doors. Through the window, she could see reporters pacing, making phone calls, speculating about what the delay meant. They're trying to figure out what to do about Dane, Thomas said, sipping cold coffee from a paper cup. His immunity agreement probably didn't anticipate him invoking the fifth about his own finances. The prosecution's in a tough spot. Daniel was quieter than Rose had ever seen him. He stared at his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough. Richard and I used to go fishing together. He came to my house for Thanksgiving. I taught his kid how to ride a bike. He looked up at Rose. How does someone do this? How does he sit there and lie about me so easily? Rose thought about that. She'd cleaned houses for wealthy people for most of her adult life, and she'd learned something important. Money did strange things to people. Not to everyone, but to enough of them. It made some people generous and others desperate. It made some people grateful and others entitled. People justify things to themselves, she said softly. I bet Richard's told himself a story where he's the victim somehow, where what he did was necessary or even right. That's how people sleep at night after doing wrong. Before Daniel could respond, a bailiff knocked on the door. Judge is ready to reconvene. When they returned to the courtroom, Rose noticed immediately that something had shifted. Thornton looked angry and cornered. Richard Dane sat at the witness stand with his lawyer beside him, and both men looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Judge Chen waited until everyone was settled before speaking. We've had some developments during the recess. Mr. Dane's attorney has informed me that his client wishes to revise certain portions of his earlier testimony. Mr. Dane, you're still under oath. Do you understand that? Richard nodded, not meeting anyone's eyes. Mr. Thornton, you may proceed, the judge said. But Thornton didn't look like he wanted to proceed. He stood stiffly. Your Honor, the prosecution requests a brief redirect examination before the defense continues their cross. Judge Chen considered this, then nodded. Very well, but keep it brief. Thornton approached his star witness, and Rose could see the prosecutor working to control his frustration. Mr. Dane, you invoked your Fifth Amendment rights regarding questions about your yacht purchase. Can you explain why? Richard swallowed hard. I need to correct something I said earlier. The yacht wasn't purchased with inheritance money. I took out a loan. A loan? From whom? A private lender. The name of this lender. Richard hesitated. I'd rather not say.